Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm Suzette Ramsunda, the Associate Director of Campus Life at Lehman College, and I'd like to ask our Vice President for Student Affairs, Dr. Jermaine Wright, to greet you.
Wonderful, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second iteration of our Distinguished Speakers Series. I'm happy to bring you greetings on behalf of President Lemons and Provost Wilson. Lehman is a special place. 85% of our population here at Lehman is comprised of Black and Latino students. Lehman ranks #1 amongst Hispanic serving institutions for helping students to climb the economic ladder. And we rank 3rd in social mobility, from helping students to go from low income to middle income. However, like most institutions across the United States, Lehman is not fraught with its challenges as it pertains to our racial justice, social justice pursuing as a campus and a community. Within that stance, our president launched a campus climate committee task force comprised of campus stakeholders who agreed that they would expand our efforts to build on the campus community that protects, values, and respects every dimension of diversity. So the climate task force came together, charged to help us to build upon our rich diversity that we have at Lehman. They assessed our current climate and provided recommendations and action item steps on how we should proceed moving forward. It was an uncomfortable and difficult time, as it's often difficult to come to grips and grasp with the realities of the things that we need to do as a campus climate. As I indicated, we have a large demographic population that are comprised of students of color, but that does not mean specifically that the work that we do is equitable and or just and that we don't have to work at it. Demographics alone does not make the institution one that prides itself on diversity. But I'm happy to say that Lehman is taking the additional step. Not only do we serve large numbers of diverse populations, from whether it be our international students to our students who are born here, we have taken that additional step through the climate survey to think about ways in which we are helping our population, our community, to be social justice oriented and mission driven. One of those recommendations of the task force was to have stimulating conversations and dialogues around diversity. So our program today is steeped within that recommendation to do just that and having riveting conversations within the campus community and beyond around diversity issues. In addition to that, the Division of Student Affairs, where I serve as the Vice President, we have gone the additional step of creating a cultural awareness and competency committee, which will provide trainings, workshops, and materials around race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, and other identities, so that we are intimately involved and engaged within the conversation of intersectionality, coined by Dr. Crenshaw, and thinking about ways in which we are highlighting, identifying, and allowing our students to be their true, genuine, and complete selves. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we are going to have with Stephen John Quaye and share with you all that even today, as a campus that's a part of the larger community system, we had conversations around diversity and the work that we will continue to do with the LGBTQ+ population, and ways in which we are acknowledging pronouns for our students and ways in which we are supporting students in all of the multiplicity of ways that they show up on campus. Providing a sense of belonging is important and paramount to academic success. If students do not perceive that they belong at an institution, they will not be retained. If they are not retained, they will not graduate. So our goal in thinking about the ways in which we support our students holistically is by supporting them through their multiple identities and the intersectionalities. I'm looking forward once again to this great conversation, and I turn it back over to Suzette, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. I am really excited to hear Dr. Quaye today. I've heard this is actually your second time to Lehman College, first virtual visit here. Dr. Stephen John Quaye is an associate professor in higher education and student affairs program at The Ohio State University, the associate editor of the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, and past president of ACPA, College Student Educators International. His previous research concentrated on engaging students in difficult dialogues about privilege, power, and oppression, and the strategies educators use to facilitate productive dialogues about these topics. His current work focuses on student and scholar activism, as well as strategies Black student affairs educators use to heal from racial battle fatigue. His work is published in different venues, including Teachers College Record, Journal of College Student Development, and the Review of Higher Education. Stephen, we welcome you to Lehman College today, and we look forward to your discussion.
Thank you so much, Suzette. I really appreciate the introduction. And Jermaine, thanks for your words as well. Before I start my talk here today, I just wanted to start off with a few words and then I will get going. So this is to beautiful Black people. I dream for you unbridled joy, the joy that produces a deep guttural laugh, stretching the corners of your mouth from a grin to a smile that it aches. The laugh you can feel in your belly, tumbling over, clutching your stomach. Unable to hold all that joy in any longer, this is my wish for you / me. Let the sun shine on you, revealing frame by frame the glistening of your skin, recalling that you are enough. More than enough, in fact. Not just sufficient, but whatever lies beyond that. Stay free. Do not contort your body to fit into these places that cannot contain your joy. Be free. Free as the wind showing no regard, free as a toddler taking those first clumsy steps with a momentum that propels you. Do not wait for reform, for small-scale shifts meant to squeeze you in. Insist on a design that had you at the center. Your Blackness is meant for oh so much more than you can even imagine. Because the four walls of whiteness have suffocated you, taking your breath away. When that breath is meant for revealing who you are, I hear the quiver in your voice, the almost inaudible question of how. That shakiness holding back the pain. Speak anyway. Shout to the depths of the universe. Move, agitate, engage, rest, repeat. Move, agitate, engage, rest, repeat. Move, agitate, engage, rest, repeat. Remember that your Blackness is magic, not a magic that makes things disappear, though I know you feel this way too often, but the magic that leaves you incredulous, uncertain of the how, but still knowing it happened. You survived, dreamed, and built something anew, like a morning sunlit corner, reminding you of the endless possibilities, showing up, existing as you are. Letting the pores of your beautiful Black skin be free and stay free. For any Black person who needs to read these words, I hope they help in some small way. For those of you who feel so broken like me, I write when I feel broken. The thing about brokenness, though, is that broken can produce something more beautiful. Like the shards of glass after they crumble on a hardwood floor, you piece together those shards, those sharp edges that once broke you, into something else. You meld the pieces together and come out stronger. Sometimes, though, you try and put the pieces back together, and there are too many tiny broken pieces to make meaning. And you just crawl into a fetal position and cry and be broken. That place, too, is okay. The thing about brokenness, again, is that it takes some of us to cry and stop, and some of us to try and create something different, something more, and perhaps even endlessly free. Today, I feel broken, but I am not in a million tiny pieces. I am not done. So I wrote those words 2 days ago after mourning the death of Dante Wright, who was shot and killed this week outside of Missouri, or Minneapolis rather. And of course, we're on the verge of Derek Chauvin's trial for killing George Floyd. On January 6th, we had white supremacists storm the Capitol. We've had anti-Asian violence that have occurred in our society. And we also are living in a time when many states are trying to put laws into place that make it harder for transgender people to live as their full selves. It was really important for me to not just move into this talk without acknowledging so much of the pain that is existing in our world right now, the pain that many of you are likely also feeling. And yet we still show up because what is the other result, right? And so for me today, I just wanted to honor the lives that have been lost through a COVID pandemic that is still disproportionately impacting Black and brown people, as well as police violence that also disproportionately impacts Black people in particular, to just let you know that you're not alone. And so throughout the talk here today, I just hope that you will take care of yourselves and just also remember to take care of each other, because again, lives are at stake. And so the work that we do really matters. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen and give you a sense of what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so the title of my keynote tonight is Who Looks Out for Us? Black Women Student Affairs Educators Working to Heal from Gender and Racial Battle Fatigue. I'll talk a bit in a minute about what racial battle fatigue is, but I really wanted to center Black women student affairs educators today because of the ways in which they show up to support students on college campuses. So let me give you a sense of how we're gonna spend our time this evening. So I want to start off by talking more broadly about some societal issues that are impacting the experience of racial battle fatigue. I then want to spend some time naming and talking about what racial battle fatigue is. And then I want to highlight a study in which I engaged in that looked at Black women student affairs educators and how they are working to heal from racial battle fatigue. And I'll spend the bulk of my time here to talk through the process of that study, some findings from it, and some lessons that we can learn from the participants as we think about ways that we might support our colleagues who are navigating and struggling with racial battle fatigue. And then I'll end with just some questions from you all and see how, what reactions you have to the words that I shared this evening. So with that, let me talk about three big issues that are impacting our society, that are going on in our society right now that are impacting, namely people of color, and in this case, Black women. So of course, we're about a year or so into a COVID-19 pandemic. One thing that we've learned from this pandemic, which we've seen countless times, is that it has disproportionate impact on Black and brown people, namely Black women. And so yes, all of us, our lives have been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of us in the room, I'm sure, have also lost somebody who has died from COVID, right? And so we're all impacted by this, but it does have different effects on certain populations. In this case, namely Black and brown women, who are often the folks who are more on the front lines and in service positions, who therefore are more impacted by this virus. So that's one big issue that is impacting and affecting what's going on in our society around racial battle fatigue. Secondly, we continue to live in a society where anti-Blackness is happening, as well as misogynoir, which is the intersection between racism and sexism that Black women in particular are navigating. Bettina Love, in her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, she really describes anti-Blackness as simply a hatred that's directed towards dark bodies, which then results in heavier policing towards those bodies. And then finally, Black women are simultaneously hyper-visible at times, but then also invisible at the same time. So since 2014 or so, we've had a number of folks of color, Black folks in particular, who have been killed by police officers. So these are just a few of those names. I highlighted 3 names in red, in part because even when we highlight the stories of Black men who are harmed by police, we often don't pay similar attention to Black women who are equally as vulnerable to violence. And so Breonna Taylor, for example, Sandra Bland, More recently, Dominique Lucius is a transgender Black woman who was killed. And so again, we often don't highlight the experiences of Black women or Black trans women who are both invisible as well as hypervisible when it comes to racial battle fatigue. So again, these are three larger issues that are happening across our society that are impacting the experience of racial battle fatigue. So what is racial battle fatigue then? So simply put, it's the exhaustion that people of color feel from continued or repeated exposure to racism, which has negative health consequences. And I'll talk about what those health consequences are in just a moment. So I often like to talk about racial battle fatigue in this way. So let's say you get a paper cut, right? And it's a paper cut, it's pretty small. You might notice it a little bit, but it doesn't really affect your day too much. So then let's say you get another paper cut, 30 minutes later in your day. You're gonna start to feel a little bit more than you did the first time. And then you get 3, 4, and then let's say by the end of the day, you now have 15 paper cuts. At that point, those small little paper cuts, which are synonymous to this case as like racial microaggressions, the very small, subtle things that happen, have accumulated over time, which then leads to a wound. So it then leads to fatigue. And so racial microaggressions are those little sort of small things. So for example, a Black person gives a speech and they're told by a white person, wow, you're really articulate, right? It doesn't feel like a very significant comment, but what do you mean by articulate? Are you saying that because I'm Black, I'm not supposed to be, right? And so it's those things that make you question what's happening. You're at the grocery store and you're paying for your groceries. You notice that the cashier puts the change in the person's hand that was in front of you. But when it comes to you to get your change, they put it on the countertop, right? And so then you start to wonder, like, why did that person do that? Or you're an Asian person and somebody asks you where you're from and you say, well, I'm from Kansas. And they ask you, no, where are you really from? So there's presumption that you're not, American, that you're foreign. So it's these little things that over time, and many paper cuts over time becomes a wound. And so that's essentially what then leads to this notion of racial battle fatigue. So like I said, it's not just that folks of color are tired. Yes, we are tired from racism, but it has these negative health consequences, psychological consequences, physiological, and then also emotional or behavioral. So psychological health consequences are things like frustration, shock, apathy, anger, hopelessness. Physiological ones are things like grinding of the teeth, headaches, high blood pressure, trouble sleeping. And then emotional behavioral are things like loss of appetite, increased use of alcohol or drugs, poor school or job performance. This poor school or job performance, in my case, is really important. So let's imagine a case where you're a person of color attending an institution, right? And you're experiencing racial battle fatigue. You're now expected to be in your classroom setting and show up and engage, but how are you supposed to do that at the same rate as your white peers if you have this extra load of racial battle fatigue on top of you, right? So of course it's going to affect your performance in your job. It's also going to affect your performance in your school, right? And so to me, this is why this is important, because that accumulation is actually having these consequences on our physical health and well-being. So then two pieces of literature that I think are really important for us to also frame this notion of racial battle fatigue is one, I talked about this earlier, but misogynoir, which is essentially the multiple systems of oppression that Black women are navigating. So Black women, because of their identity as both Black and women, they're navigating these larger systems of oppression. Racism is one of them, as well as sexism, right? So they're having to combat these systems of oppression simultaneously, which leads to an extra layer of fatigue that they're going to experience. And then self-care and healing. So what are the ways that people try to take care of themselves in the midst of this, right? So so healing is like a much more substantive process where you're addressing the root of the problem, whereas participants often said that self-care is more temporary. These are like the temporary fixes, and we'll talk more about those pieces in just a moment. So having laid the groundwork then for what racial battle fatigue is, as well as the larger context that is impacting what the experience of racial battle fatigue. And I want to spend the remainder of the time really talking about some research that I conducted a couple years ago. So I noticed that when I was talking to my colleagues of color, namely my Black colleagues, they would often say to me, Stephen, I'm feeling really exhausted. Like I'm feeling like I don't know how to show up and teach this class that I have to teach. Or I often talk about the racism I'm experiencing, and my white peers or colleagues, they minimize it or they don't really understand what I'm saying. And I kept hearing these smaller anecdotal stories from my Black colleagues. And so I wanted to understand, well, how are other people experiencing or navigating this? So I did a study where I interviewed with a research team, 35 Black student affairs educators at various institutions. Some of these were entry-level professionals. So some of them were folks who were resident directors in residence halls. Some were academic advisors. Some were more mid-level professionals. So like an assistant director of an office or a director of an office. And then a few were also more senior level. So a dean of students or the vice president of student affairs. So again, these were 35 Black student affairs people across various institutions to understand not only how they were experiencing racial battle fatigue, but I wanted to know more specifically, what do you do to take care of yourself in the midst of this, right? So what strategies do you use to work to self-care or heal in the midst of racial battle fatigue? As we analyzed the data from the study, we noticed that there were some commonalities between Black men and Black women in the study, but that Black women were also expressing something that was qualitatively different than their Black male peers. And so we decided to look just at the data from the 24 Black women participants and center their stories. And so that's what I'm going to share with you tonight, is what we found from the interviews that we conducted with these 24 Black women student affairs educators. So this particular quote from Trinity highlights the way in which I'm going to talk about what we learned from the study. So Trinity said, as Black women, because we have been those nurturing women, we say that we can do it. We'll do that because we know we got to get our foot in the door. But then it's like, who looks out for us? We look out for everybody else because that's what we do as nurturers. But who looks out for us? That's problematic to me. So Trinity frames the way in which I titled my talk here today, who looks out for us? And again, that question of like, who is there to support and look out for Black women when they are looking out for so many other people? And so there are 4 particular ways that participants said their colleagues are not looking out for them. And I'll share data from each of these. One was seeing Black women as superwomen. So as the source of service and help who can take care of everybody else's needs, while no one else was taking care of their needs. Secondly, they talked about what the experience of gendered racial battle fatigue feels like. And then third, they talked about how often when Black folks were killed, that there was often silence from their white colleagues around this and how that exacerbated their racial battle fatigue. And then lastly, they talked about self-care and healing. So I'm going to talk about these four findings and give some data and voices from participants to share with you to help paint a picture of how they were saying their colleagues were not looking out for them in their racial battle fatigue that they were experiencing. So let's start with Black women as superwomen. And this manifested in 3 different ways: the roles and responsibilities of the superwoman, superwoman expectations in white spaces, and then Black men and non-Black people of color. So that's what that acronym is, NBPOC, non-Black people of color, reinforcing superwoman expectations. So starting with the roles and responsibilities of the superwoman. So Destiny shared two powerful quotes in this particular section. She said, "I'm not very motherly, so it's really annoying to be put in this kind of mammy type role, if you will. I'm nothing like that." Later on in her interview, Destiny said, "My students see me as, you know, Destiny, come and help me, come protect me from this, come and hold me, come and take care of me." And I'm like, who's taking care of me? I'm tired too, and I'm always the sassy one. I'm always the one that has to be the mother figure. I'm always those kinds of things. Destiny's quotes, I think, are really powerful in part one, because she points out this notion of the mammy type role, which again is the way in which during the era of slavery, right, Black women were often expected to take care of their slave owners' children, right? And so they were positioned as like mammies. And so in contemporary present day society, Destiny was saying sometimes that's how she feels she's treated by her peers, right? As like this person who's supposed to come take care of them, and that she doesn't get to center her own needs because she's always having to worry about other people's needs. Superwoman expectations in white spaces. Becky said, my hair naturally is a giant afro, but I got a new job, so I have to ease in. Even though I'm not going to start no Angela Davis type riot, I think that my afro communicates that. It's not fair, but it's the reality. I love my afro. It's really big and it's really healthy. If I'm going to keep my new job, I have to ease it for about 6 months. I wish I could just exist and be me and not have to worry about all the things of being a Black woman. So in this particular case, Becky worked at a predominantly white institution where she's one of the few women of color at her institution. She talked about how, because of that, she often has to pay attention to how she dresses. And so because of the ways in which her colleagues would often make comments about her hair or ask to touch her hair, like all of these things that she has to pay attention to that, which is exhausting, right? So that also then contributes to the racial battle fatigue that she's experiencing. Unfortunately, it wasn't just Black women's white colleagues who are also harmful at times. Sometimes Black men and also non-Black people of color also reinforce these expectations. So Trinity said, in dealing with racial battle fatigue, seeing more unity between Black women and Black men, because Black men watch stuff happen to Black women, and it's like, oh, okay, she'll be okay. No, bro, that ain't how it happens. So again, not only do her white colleagues expect that Black women are these superhuman characters who nobody else has to prioritize their needs and can take care of everybody else, but sometimes too, even folks who were supposed to look out for them most, Black men and other non-Black people of color, also reinforce these superwoman expectations at times too. The second finding then, it relates to how gendered racism makes Black women feel. So one of the common ways in which she described it was that they just feel exhausted. And Kathy said, I was explaining to one of my coworkers, it's gendered racial battle fatigue. It's kind of like wearing a heavy coat that's wet that you didn't pick to put on you, but it's on you. And even when you feel like you have a lot of strength, at some point that coat just gets heavier. So imagine wearing this heavy coat, right? It's that extra weight, that extra burden that I was talking about earlier. Another one of the participants talked about that she does CrossFit a lot. And one of the things that she said that she does in CrossFit is that they often wear a weighted vest. So it makes the CrossFit routine more difficult, more challenging. And so she described this as like racial battle fatigue is like when she's often having to wear that weighted vest around. It's this extra layer of weight that is on her that she's often having to navigate. It also makes participants feel angry. So Destiny said, I think a lot about anger, but it's more on the lines of suppressed anger. It's like I can't be quite as raw as I would like to be. So there's a stereotype, right, that exists in our society around the angry Black woman. And even if I recently listened to Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, and she talked about this notion of as the first lady and a Black woman, how she often had to suppress her anger, right? As to not be portrayed as the angry Black woman. And so many of the participants often talked about that too, and how that made them angry, but they couldn't express that anger, right? They were often having to suppress it, to let it go. And then finally, it also made them feel hopeless. I feel like I just can't win, said Sarah. It's exactly what it says. It's just fatigue. I get tired of educating people. I get tired of telling them, no, you shouldn't say that to a student. You shouldn't say that to another employee. It gets overwhelming sometimes. I go home and my husband laughs sometimes. He's like, I can't believe you deal with that and you work in higher ed. I'm like, yeah, it's a battle. It's exactly what it is. Sometimes I just can't deal with it today. I get tired. So there's this perception, right, that those of us who work in higher ed, that we work in these very progressive spaces where this shouldn't happen, right? But yet Sarah was saying that even her husband said, wow, I can't believe that this is happening to you even in higher ed. So again, it's that feeling of being hopeless that she's often having to educate people about what they shouldn't do, right? And that also contributes then to her racial battle fatigue. So finding number 3 then relates to how white silence about Black death impacts Black women. So TC said, I work with these people 8 hours a day and we do staff bonding, you know, we celebrate birthdays and all these special days, but it was something serious and we didn't check in with each other. So TC is referring to, she was referring to when Michael Brown was shot and killed in 2014. And it was a vivid memory that she had. She went to work that next day and she said folks just moved on business as usual. Like there was no acknowledgement that perhaps she was in pain, that this tragedy had happened. And yet her white colleagues were often silent about it. And she needed them to speak up, to let her, to engage with her, to ask how she was doing, right? But that silence was again exacerbating it. So when stuff is happening in our world, like we have to acknowledge it. So that's one of the things that TC mentioned. And then finally, participants talked about how they work to try to heal or engage in self-care in the midst of racial battle fatigue. So Zuri said, I always have mixed feelings about the word self-care as it's so tied to capitalism. I think about healing in a very communal way because I depend on a lot of people to help me heal, to listen to me, to support me. So focusing on the self, I think is important, but I think community care, I think is in the context of working in higher ed, I think is more important to me and how we help each other take care of ourselves. So what you see here is participants wrestling with the distinction between self-care and healing as ways to address racial battle fatigue. So they often said self-care was more temporary fixes. So these were things like exercising, getting a pedicure, relaxing, watching TV, things to temporarily take their minds off of what they were experiencing, but it didn't really address the root of the problem, which again was the racism and sexism that they were navigating. So healing for them was a more sustainable long-term process that was addressing the root of the issue and which often occurred in the midst of a community of hanging out with other Black folks that they could process with. So let me talk about 4 sort of big takeaways from the words of participants this evening. So one is this notion that intersectionality matters, right? So it was the intersection of racism and sexism is what made Black women student affairs educators especially vulnerable to oppression, that they were navigating both of these systems simultaneously, and which contributed, again, to making Black women educators invisible, as well as also hyper-visible at times. Point number 2 then, sort of takeaway, is the limits of racial battle fatigue. So what's interesting here is that often we were asking participants to center themselves in this interview. So to talk about their own lives, their own experiences with racial battle fatigue. And many of them talked about their partners, even in this interview, how they were scared for their husbands, how they were scared for the Black men in their lives. So it shows that even in an interview process that was dedicated to Black women sharing their experiences, they still spoke of Black men in their lives, which to me illustrates some of the limits of just the lens of racial battle fatigue, that it doesn't really capture the complexities of the sexism that these Black women are also navigating. So again, it goes back to this notion of the intersectionality or the misogynoir that I talked about earlier is really important. These systems are happening at the same time. Caring and student affairs is sort of the third big takeaway. So these participants worked in a helping profession. Many of you are also educators who are here tonight, right? And so those of us who work in helping professions, the belief is that we're supposed to center the needs of the students we work with, right? Of everybody else and not ever ourselves. And so because of these expectations of what a helping profession is, it exacerbated this feeling of racial battle fatigue, that the expectations that Black women educators be superwomen were exhausting, they were unrealistic, and they didn't allow participants to rest, to be vulnerable, or to say no at times. And so again, that's another big takeaway here. And the number 4 for me is that self-care is not synonymous with healing. As I talked about in the last quote from Zuri, where she was talking again about like the community care, right? So self-care is more temporary. There are these temporary fixes, but healing is a much more sustainable process and aided in lessening participants' trauma that they were experiencing. And this had to be in the community of other Black women with which to process their experiences. So 4 things that I think you all can do to support those in your lives who are navigating racial battle fatigue. Number 1 for me is to resist unrealistic expectations of Black women. So we can't expect them to be the caretakers for everybody. We can't expect them to sacrifice themselves and nobody else look out for them. But that we have to allow room for Black women to show up in whatever ways that are necessary that enables them to exist as their full selves. So to me, number 1, again, is to resist having these unrealistic expectations of Black women. Number 2 then is Black men show up. So this, I put myself in this case too, as a Black man, that we often did not show up for the Black women in our lives. Like, they often prioritized us. Like I said, even in an interview dedicated to them talking about themselves, they were still talking about the ways in which they were centering Black men in their lives. And so we have to show up for them and take some of the onus off of them for having to save and take care of everybody else, because they're really not getting that support from any place. So we have to show up and support them. Number 3 then is to acknowledge the extra labor. So those of us who are supervisors of Black women can acknowledge the extra labor in which they often have to engage. So often when Black death happens in our society, it's Black women who spend the time to acknowledge that that's happening, right? To prioritize that. And so this is extra labor in which they are often engaged in. It's extra uncompensated labor. Black women are often asked to serve on committees on our campuses. They're often asked to do these extra work. They often meet with students of color, right? They do all of these extra things that are not sometimes part of their job description. So we have to compensate them for that extra labor through time off, and then more importantly, through stepping up to take some of the onus off of them for being the ones who always have to do that. And then number 4 is pay attention to Black violence and death. One of the most significant findings from this study, and it occurred across all of the 24 Black women participants in the study, was when they said, I need my white colleagues to acknowledge when a Black person is killed. The silence is really harmful. We can't just go on business as usual as if nothing has happened. This week in particular has been really heavy for many Black folks, right? And so what are we doing to acknowledge the pain that Black women are experiencing? And so I'm gonna say that, and I'm gonna put a caveat on that. So sometimes too, as white folks, you can reach out to show your support, but reach out without the expectation that Black women have to respond to you. Like sometimes, like they just need to take care of themselves. And so if you're reach out because you feel like you want to and you need to, not because you need validation from Black women in that moment. So I think that's really important, is to reach out, but not have the expectation that you're reaching out means that they have to engage with you, because they might need to just rest in that moment. So that's number 4 for me. So with that, I want to open up for any questions, comments that you all have. But again, the whole goal of this was to center racial battle fatigue, talk about what it is. And my hope is that, again, I appreciate the time and I look forward to engaging with you all at this time.
Thank you, Stephen. So we have some questions that folks submitted when they registered. So we'll start off with some of those questions. Our grad student, Jonathan Yubi Gomez, will read some of them. But if you do want to submit questions, you can put those questions in the chat and we will try to get to them. So John, go ahead.
Hi, good evening.
Uh-oh.
You're muted.
Hi. I thought
Mm.
Okay. This is it. I'm unmuted. Thank you so much for this dialogue. It's been really insightful, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and listen. So some of the questions, I'm going to go through them in no particular order, but the first one that came to mind and I wanted to address because it was also, it's very relevant. It's how do you include the Asian American Pacific Islander community in race talks to diversify higher education curriculum?
Yeah, so to me, this is, I really appreciate this question. And so I think part of the way that we can do this is by remembering first and foremost that all of these oppressions are linked, they're connected. And the whole goal of the way in which white supremacy works is it pits communities of color against each other. That at times when we center Black people, it means that we're not centering Asian Americans. When we center Asian Americans, well, what about Black people, right? And meanwhile, white supremacy is still maintaining, and nobody's addressing that, right? So I think the way in which to do that is to first and foremost remember that my oppression is connected to yours. They may not be the same, right? But they're linked in some way. That it's all around, like, again, this system of whiteness. And so to me, I think that comes through like paying attention to in your classes, like who are the authors that you're having your students read? Like, do they have different identities? Like, are Asians included in your readings, right? So often Asian Americans are looked upon as quote unquote the model minority, that they're often not seen as like people of color. They're often seen as like outside of that group, right? But I think helping understand the history of oppression and the ways in which they're uniquely oppressed because of their identity. I mentioned one of the ways in which is like this notion of being seen as like perpetual foreigners, of like not ever being from this place, being constantly asked like, where are you really from, is one way. So I think helping people see the ways in which Asian Americans are also oppressed, I think helps me as a Black person, for example, see how my liberation is tied to their liberation as well too, right? So I think that's one important way. The other thing that I'll add is like, so when that white person shot and killed, people across 3 different spas in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago, 6 of whom were Asian women, I saw a lot of articles being written about like, in what ways is the Black community like stepping up for Asian Americans? And to me, one of the, like, I was often bothered by these articles, in part because what I thought they were trying to do was, again, to illustrate that that somehow like Black folks were not showing up, when in reality, like, they were not looking at the ways, again, in which many of them were, right? And yes, some of them maybe were not, but again, it was trying to, I think, see division here in a way that was unhealthy. And so I wanted to see more efforts around like, how are we actually engaged in solidarity? Like, I did see a lot of stuff from like the movement from Black Lives that were also talking about like how their oppression is connected to ours, right? And so to me, I think those are some ways in which to do that. And again, it all goes back to understanding how my survival is tied to yours as well. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you so much. Yes, and so the next question I have is how can colleges and higher education institutions support faculty and staff who have racial battle fatigue?
Yeah, so I think the number one way is those of us in the room who are white. I think it's your responsibility to step up and to address race and racism. In 1994, Cornel West wrote the book Race Matters, and there's a line from that book that I still think is very applicable to us right now in 2021. I'm paraphrasing the line, but it was something to the effect of, the problem of racism will never go away if we don't see the ways in which it's not just an issue that's impacting Black people, right? It's not just our issue. That white folks have to be engaged in this, to address it, to talk with their white friends and colleagues. If you're a parent in the room and you're white and and you have children who are white, like it's your job to talk with them about race and racism, to expose them to readings from people of color, right? So to me, I think that's like the number one way that when white folks step up, it helps people of color rest and heal and not have to be the people who speak out the most. So I think that's number one for me. Number two then is to also, for people of color to see the ways in which we have community. One of the most damaging effects of racism is that it makes us feel alone. Like it makes us feel isolated. Like we're the only ones who are experiencing this. And I think the more that we can find community with other people, I think it helps us also engage and sustain ourselves and helps us to heal from our racial battle fatigue. Another thing for me, number three is, and I will always say this in these kinds of spaces, but I've been in therapy for about 4 or 5 years now. And I think particularly for Black folks, we are often, therapy is often stigmatized in communities of color for very valid reasons. Like sometimes we've gone to therapists and we've named our racism and we've been minimized or we haven't been believed, right? And so to me, I think there's a reason why that's the case. But I think having structured spaces in which to engage with somebody and ask questions back, I think also helps address racial battle fatigue. So I think those are 3 ways in which to really do that.
Thank you so much. So the next question I have is regarding public schools. How do public schools rebuild the trust of families who have not only been disproportionately affected by COVID and the surrounding fallout, but by the systematic racism that precedes our current circumstances?
So this is a big question. So can you repeat it one more time for me, please?
Yeah, and even if you can chip off one little bit from that, I know it's very big. So how do public schools rebuild the trust of families who have not only been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 and the surrounding fallout, but by the systematic racism that precedes our current circumstances?
So the reason that this one is a tough one for me is because trust, I think trust is a really hard thing to rebuild once it's been lost. And I think it takes time. I think for me, one of the primary ways that trust starts to be built back is when there's ownership, and when there's an apology that is actually meaningful, right? And so taking ownership over why the trust was lost, where it came from. And so I don't have the luxury of having the context behind this question, but to me, the trust piece is the piece that I think really stood out to me of like that rebuilding process. So I think taking ownership and then engaging in conversations, in sustained structured conversations about this. And so as an example, for this talk that I'm giving today on racial battle fatigue, I don't expect after one talk on racial battle fatigue that you're going to be transformed and you're going to go out and do something different necessarily, right? But maybe after the 3rd or 4th, it has to be sustained. And so I think in continuing to engage families and sustain conversations where that trust can be rebuilt, I think is also really critical. And then I want to talk about the COVID-19 piece here too. So I mentioned this in an earlier session that I had today. What's interesting to me is over the last year, and I've heard this from a number of people too, I am more exhausted now and have worked more in the last year than I have previously. And so it's interesting to me, like in a time when we are in the midst of a pandemic that is affecting all of us so substantially, why is it that we didn't just say, stop, pause, and let's not keep doing, right? And so to me, I think that's like another interesting piece is like, if now is the time that we're not going to start saying no and pausing, then when on earth are we going to, right? And so I think part of what has happened between schools and families is this notion of of sometimes expecting more than we've been doing, right? And again, this disproportionately falls on Black women, who are often the ones who are doing more in this climate who are often the ones who are juggling all of these other responsibilities, right? And so to me, I think that's another piece. I don't know if it's related to that question, but it's something that has come up for me time and time again, that this is perfect time for us to just pause and just be for a bit, but yet we haven't really done that as members of society.
Stephen, I want to jump in and ask you this question because I want to take advantage of the fact that you're here. How are we passing down this trauma or racial battle fatigue to our kids and maybe not realizing this?
Yeah, so this one, I feel like this is a whole nother talk, Suzette, but like, I mean, the thing that, so let me answer it this way. So one of the things that researchers have found is that generational trauma is passed down from generation to generation. So there's actual research that shows that Holocaust survivors, for example, can pass on the trauma of the Holocaust to their children and grandchildren and so on and so forth. And so for me, one of the ways in which I think I might do it at times, so I have a 10-year-old, and I have had conversations with my 10-year-old Sebastian about race and racism, and about like my fear driving in rural white areas, about being pulled over by the police and what to do if that happens to me, and who he can call and who is the neighbor who he can go find if for some reason he's there and I don't come home, right? So we've had these conversations, and I often struggle with the honesty in which I've had these conversations with him, because I know in some way I'm likely passing on some level of trauma to him. Yes, I want Sebastian fundamentally to believe that he can grow up in our society and be and do anything that he wants to do. But the reality is, like, as a Black boy, like, that is not the case. And so I feel if I'm not having those conversations with him, I'm not being honest as a parent, right? And so there's no easy way in which to do this. To me, I think it's a classic case of like both and, that I can have that conversation with him and still talk to him about the ways in which he can fight and have agency also in this society as a Black boy, right? And so I think that's one way in which to do it. But you're right, Suzette. Like, I think we do sometimes pass on that trauma. And I think for me, I've come down on the decision time and time again of to still have the conversation, because I don't want him to be shocked the first time he experiences racism, so that it's so debilitating that he's not able to address it or recover from it, right? So to me, that's why I do it, but it doesn't feel like it's the right way all the time, even if I know why I'm doing it, but it's hard, right? And so that's like my best sort of answer at this moment, but we do it. I mean, it is the case. And I think the way that I have reconciled with it is to also illustrate to him again, where can he find places of agency in the process of knowing that this might happen, but how can he still show up in all of who he is as a Black boy and still have joy in the process and agency, and have that freedom that I was talking about at the start of my talk here today. So that's my best thinking on that question at the moment.
Thank you. I have a question from a student, which is, do you have book recommendation or video recommendations on how to educate children about racism?
Oh, good question. I'll have to look at this and I can get back to the person, but I mean, every year there's a ton of things. Like I've just Googled like how to talk to kids about racism, and several things have come up. So I don't have the exact thing off the top of my head, but I can look and get back to the person. But one of the things, so some of the things that I think are really important are, again, paying attention to, I think you can have, like in books that you read, I think it's really important that when you look at your bookshelf in your house, who are the authors of those children's books? Like, to me, that's the one most important way to start to have those conversations. Like, by introducing your kids to authors of different races, it brings up the conversations naturally. So then they're reading a story and they can say, oh, wow, this person's skin color is different from mine. Like, let's talk about that, right? But if your child is only reading books from characters that are white, it doesn't provide those opportunities to talk about them. So to me, I think that's one sort of resource in which to do that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend sharing this book with a child, but one book that I have really found powerful as a parent is, it's called My Grandmother's Hands. And it's a book around, it's a Black counselor who wrote a book around like how we work to heal from trauma. And so to me, one of the primary ways in which to talk with kids about race and racism is the reason that I started therapy was because I noticed that as a parent, I was not showing up as my best self because my racial battle fatigue was really impacting my parenting. And that was a perfect way in which that was the most significant way I was going to pass on my trauma to Sebastian. And so reading this book and engaging in therapy to me was a way to free myself so I could have those conversations with Sebastian without them those conversations re-traumatizing me. So I love My Grandmother's Hands because I think the book is really effective at giving us effective tools for working on our own trauma so we can heal. The other thing I like about that book in particular is he also talks about how white folks are also navigating trauma in all of this, right? And he talks about like police officers as well. So I think he includes, I think, a lot of groups in this that we may not think are dealing with trauma. It's different from the trauma that people of color are dealing with, but it's still trauma that I think is worth unlearning and exploring because we're all invested in this process of moving towards anti-racism, right? And so all of us, it has to take all of us in which to do that. So that's the second piece that I'll share. The last thing, and again, I know the question was around what videos or resources, but I'm taking the opportunity to share my own resources. So forgive me for doing that. But the last thing that I think is also like really important is that is honesty. Like honesty is so critical. So let me give an example. This is one of I don't remember many things from my childhood, but there's certain things that really stand out to me. One of the things that I most vividly remember is I was probably about 6 years old. And I was with my mom in a grocery store. And there was another kid, like I was sitting in the shopping cart. My mom was pushing me around and I turned my head and there was a white kid who was in the shopping cart next to me, probably about the same age. Literally probably at the top of his lungs, this kid pointed at me and said, "Mommy, look, that kid's skin is darker than mine." And in that moment, that child's parent like shushed that child in the grocery store. And I'll never forget that because what the shushing did was it inadvertently told that child that you are not to point out and talk about skin color. And so again, it's a subtle thing, but why it stood out to me is because now as a parent, I recognize that it is perfectly natural for children to point out skin color. Like they are not associating any sort of like judgment on that skin color. It's merely a difference that they're pointing out in their world. We as grownups are the ones who put judgment on that skin color. And so when we shush our child when they point out skin color, we are telling them that there's something problematic about identifying or naming skin color or naming race. So again, we're the ones who are putting judgment on it. Like differences in and of themselves are not problematic. It's the judgments that we put on those differences that become problematic. So why I say honesty is really important, because in that moment, I think the best thing you can do in that moment is to engage your child. Yes, it was likely hella embarrassing, right? In that middle of that grocery store for your child to yell out that skin color is darker than mine, right? But yet in that moment, a simple, you should have said, oh yeah, son, like, yeah, that's right. And then maybe later on you have that conversation, but not putting judgment on it in that moment. Or ask a question like, tell me what you think about that, or what does that mean to you, right? So these are questions we can ask as like follow-up, but being honest with people when we're engaged in race conversations, children, I think is really important. So talking about that skin color differences what they are and that they do matter, and here's why they matter, and here's how we're going to address it in our home, right? And so I think that's another way in which to do it, is to embrace it and to not like be embarrassed by it, but how might we actually use it as an opportunity for talking with our child in that moment about it. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer. Clearly I have a lot of things to say about that, but yeah, so that's my response to that.
Thank you. And that last part was very powerful, the child in the grocery store. Thank you for sharing. So we're going to pivot over now. One of the questions submitted was, in your research, have you studied the effects of physical chronic disease developing as a result from racism? The question then goes on to say, I ask because in medical anthropology, it's known that chronic stress, which can stem from racism, can keep cortisol levels elevated, that can play a role in disease such as coronary heart disease and diabetes.
Yeah, so that's a good question. My answer is no, I haven't. I've only studied the effects of people talking about racial battle fatigue. I do know that there is like that connection. So I'm actually interested in talking more about that, because I do think it frames to me even more so why I think it's really important for us to address it, because again, it's being felt and it's impacting people's bodies. That's the one piece I'll say. So I haven't studied it directly, but I do appreciate the person raising that point, because to me, again, it illustrates that it's not just that people of color are complaining about racism, but it's that it's actually impacting our bodies and our well-being in substantive ways.
Thank you. So the next question is from one of our professors here at Lehman. So he starts by saying, thank you for your wisdom and words you wrote at the start. They were fire. He then says, what do we do to support our mixed race colleagues, allies, families, and friends?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, so let me make sure I understand the question. So mixed race meaning like multiracial people? Is that what that, okay, just want to make sure. So this one, I'm stumped on this one. I think part of the reason why I'm stumped is because my only sort of like answers would be like more anecdotal stuff. So for example, one of the struggles that I think mixed race people feel is not being enough of either identity, right? Like when it comes to, like, let's say in Black spaces, if a person identifies as both Black and white, is like, well, I have a white part too, so am I really part of the quote unquote Black community, right? And so am I impacted by racism in that same way, right? And so I think that's part of the struggle here. So part of it for me, I think, is also acknowledging the struggles that mixed race people are also navigating. Again, it goes back to this question of like seeing the ways in which oppressions are linked together. So understanding some of the challenges that mixed race people might be facing. I think that's one way in which to like support them. Finding structured spaces in which to name what's happening, to talk about it. So those of us who are faculty in our classes, are we providing opportunities for students to talk about those identities that they have? And then also maybe like affinity groups. And so one of the things that I think is also really important, and I talked about this earlier today, is sometimes we have to have affinity groups. And so what that means is like groups that are of just one identity talking with each other. So are there spaces where mixed race people can engage with other mixed race people only about these issues? Similarly, sometimes it's really important for white folks to only talk with other white people about their whiteness before having more cross-racial dialogue. So I think also affinity groups might be a space in which mixed race people can also gain some of the support that they might need to process their unique experiences in these dialogues.
Thank you. All right, the next question is, how do you create a working environment that encourages naming and repairing the harm in a predominantly white institution?
So I think the first thing that comes to mind is, so whose responsibility is it for doing this repair question would be, it's the responsibility of people who are in positions of power. On most of our campuses, those people often hold more dominant identities. By dominant identities, I mean identities in which people are experience privilege or power. So in our society, white people, heterosexual people, Christian men, those are folks who hold more dominant identities and are often in positions of power. So if we look at our schools, K through 12, who's often the principal? What are their identities? More often than not, they're probably white men. In our post-secondary institutions, so who is the president of Lehman, right? Who's in the VP positions? Who's in Dean of Students positions, right? So yes, sometimes there will be folks of color in those spaces as well, but they're few and far between, right? And so I think it's the responsibility of white folks to provide space for repairing that harm. Because if white folks are not invested in this, then it's only seen as something that's affecting people of color, and therefore we're not going to do anything to address it. So to me, I think that's one important way, is for white folks to take responsibility for addressing that. The other way that I'll answer this question, number 2, is part of why I wrote those words at the start, and notice that I addressed it to beautiful Black people. My reason for addressing it that way is because I worked really hard in my life to not let white people steal my joy. Like the reality is, like, one of the ways in which I engage in resistance is, even in the midst of feeling broken like I have this week, is to find spaces of joy and gratitude and celebration. And that's often in community with other Black people. So to me, I think that's another way in which we can address harm, is by people of color joining together, building coalitions, having agency, and finding ways to have joy. And I don't mean that in like a trite or like cheesy sort of way. Like, I actually mean it in that joy is resistance, it's agency. It's like basically saying, like, I'm still going to celebrate the joy of my dark Black skin, and I'm going to like show up still in the midst of all of this. And it doesn't mean, like, to go back to the data from participants, it doesn't mean that we become like that for Black women, that it means like you're Black Superwoman who can never show any sort of like weakness. So I don't want it to get to that place. But I do think there's some importance in having agency and showing joy in the midst of this, which I think is one sort of important way to resist white supremacy that's happening. So that's something else that I would add.
Thank you. So the next question is more personal. It's, what put you on the path that you walk today, and how do you see your work transforming the lives of students?
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to think of the non-long way to answer this question. So I am an immigrant. I was born in Ghana. You know, when I say the non-long way, then I start telling you about my biography, right? So this is already becoming a long answer. So I'm an immigrant. I was born in Ghana, but the reason that I share that is because, like many immigrants, my parents put my siblings and I have 3 siblings in schools that they thought would set us up for success later in life. Those schools were in predominantly white areas. It wasn't until my junior year of college that for the first time I had a teacher who was not white. Dr. Ashir Nassim was my developmental psychology professor as a sophomore, right? And he's the first person who gave me the belief that if I wanted to be a professor, I could do it. I didn't realize the impact in that moment, but you know, the expression representation matters. It really mattered for me in that moment, because up until that point, I didn't think I could be a professor because I had not ever seen people who looked like me in front of a classroom. So I think that's what really put me on the path to really wanting to be, quote unquote, that possibility model for other Black students who might also see somebody like me in front of a space and believe, oh wow, like I can do that if I want to, right? So to me, I think was like an important piece for me. And then I mentioned like the therapy piece. And so when Michael Brown was shot and killed on August 9th, 2014, like that date, I vividly remember that date. And it's because I had grown up in predominantly white spaces to believe that if I dressed the right way, if I learned and spoke proper English, if I let go of my accent, if I studied hard, that white people would find me acceptable. And I could be one of those exceptions, right, to the norm. And I realized in that moment with Michael Brown that I could do all of these things and I'm still just as vulnerable, right? And so to me, that was the moment that set me on the path of really trying to explore racial battle fatigue. Again, because I was feeling so much anguish and anger and not knowing what to do with that. And it was impacting my relationships. It was impacting my teaching. It was impacting my parenting. And so I needed to stop and do something different to try and heal from that. And then I wanted to learn what other people are doing and I wanted to support other Black folks in also working to heal from our racial battle fatigue, because I saw the ways that it was also impacting them and not enabling them to show up as their full selves. And so to me, I think that's what set me on the path towards that. And then I think the last part of your question was something around like transforming the lives of students. Like, I'm a little hesitant to address that part, only because like it feels awkward for me to say I am transforming the lives of students, right? And so like, students should tell you that, right? And so I think part of how I sort of like deal with that aspect is I focus on showing up every day, showing the ways in which I exist in my Black skin, being honest about my struggles, supporting students. And my hope is that that's enough and that they see some possibilities from me doing that. And perhaps I am, transforming their lives from how I show up. But I can't really control whether or not that's the case, but I focus on me. I focus on giving my best and doing what I can. And then I sort of let the pieces fall as they may. So that's, I think, hopefully that along the way, some lives are being transformed, but sometimes I don't know that. And that's the hard part of being an educator. It may be 10 years down the road where somebody says, oh yeah, that's what happened. And so I did write to my professor at JMU, Dr. Nassim, this semester actually, to tell him about the ways in which he impacted me. So this is my sort of push to you all. If there is somebody out there who's impacted you, let them know. I think it's important because we're all in this work together. And I think it makes a difference if you let somebody know that they played a role in your life.
So that leads me to my next question, and I've been instructed that is my last question. So hopefully, everyone thinks this is a good one. But one of our students asked, being Black, we are often expected to work harder to get to a place white people have already been. How would you suggest taking time for yourself, for your own mental health, when facing structural and systematic racism?
Yeah, so I grew up with the mantra from my dad of, you have to work twice as hard as your white peers to achieve half of success, right? So it's this belief that when you're a person of color, like we have to show up differently. And that puts a lot of pressure on Black students, on Black young people, right? And so I think for me, part of how I do that is finding joy. I mentioned that earlier. So the things that I do, like I'm a runner, I run, I bike, I cycle. I don't work on the weekends. I have a very strict boundary about that. That's the way that I practice care as well. This is the first time in a long time that I've done something in the evening. Like it was about 4 o'clock and I was like ready for a nap. So this is like, late for me too. So I think that's the other thing that I do too, is like I have strict boundaries about my time. And then I think lastly, I try my hardest to surround myself with people who fulfill me and who sustain me. So I'm very intentional about building my community. I'm very intentional about spending time with students of color in the program, because they often sustain me. And so, yeah, I think those are some things around my mental health. I mentioned like counseling. I started off this talk with like those words. Like for me, writing is like it's very therapeutic for me. I do art as well too. Like even though all I can do is really stick figures, but it still gives me joy, like trying to create and design something. So I think those are ways. And I think the last thing, and this is probably the most important for me, for Black folks in the room, to Black students in particular, is I try really hard to focus on the things that are within my control. I call it my sphere of influence. So for example, when Donald Trump was president, like folks would often talk to me about, well, did you see what happened today? And I would say, I'm not interested in having that conversation, partly because I am never going to interact with President Biden, with President Obama, although I would love to meet President Obama, with President Obama or President Trump, right? So spending my energy getting frustrated about what they're doing is not sustainable. It's not going to sustain me. And it doesn't mean that I don't pay attention to what's going on in the world with them, but it just means that I try really hard to focus on the places in which I have control. This semester, I'm teaching a class with 24 students in it on a weekly basis. That's my sphere of influence. If I can spend my time focusing on those students, it gives me more control over my energy, right? So that's what I also try to do, is I try to let go of the things that are beyond my control. And it's not always easy. This week, I spent way too much time on MSNBC watching the Derek Chauvin trial. And I could literally feel my blood pressure rising like by the minute as I was watching. And yet I still made a harmful choice to keep watching, partly because some ways I needed to, and I also knew it wasn't sustaining me. But so all of it is to say that sometimes I make choices that are not good for me personally, but I also don't beat myself up over it. I give myself grace. So I think also extend yourself grace when you don't show up in the ways that you want to, because that's also like really critical and important. So those are some things. But this has been a joy. I know my question and time is up, and I really have appreciated spending time with you all tonight. I hope you took away some lessons, and I'm always happy to continue engaging and reaching out. I am going to put my email address in the chat box in case folks want to follow up. But again, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight.
And Mr. Sullivan?
Stephen, welcome back. We were at a conference a few years ago.
Yes, I thought you looked familiar, actually.
Hi. Well, on behalf of the Campus Life staff, Suzette Ramsunder, David Chakarte, Nathaniel Gasquet, Denny Santos, Margaret Regis, and Jonathan Ubi Gomez, who is an excellent narrator, we want to thank you for your scholarly thoughts and insights. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Janet D. Simone and the Masters in Organizational Leadership program, who's also been very involved in leadership. And finally, and this is a bit of a switch, I would like to, Dr. Jermaine Wright, who's our new Vice President of Student Affairs, perhaps to say the final words. And I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot, Jermaine. Can you unmute him, David?
There we go. I was able to unmute. Thank you for that, Mr. Sullivan. I was often taught you always have to stay ready. So when you're called upon, you're always ready to give the final word. I want to say I have thoroughly enjoyed your conversation, Stephen. It has been gratifying to hear the scholarly pursuits, but think about them in practical ways in which I have chosen the career path that I've chosen personally and the work that I've done personally, from working with the CUNY Black Male Initiative to the Office of Special Programs and Seeking College Discovery, and now here at Lehman, with the intentionality of serving Black and Brown students and the calling in which it is, having seen students like myself and saying, there is a future, Dr. Jermaine Wright, someone who has spoken life into me and saying, you can be a vice president. Because from humble beginnings, we've all began. And I share my own story to say that I grew up not too far from Lehman in the Bronx. And had it not been for my mother being able to attend Lehman, I would not be the vice president before you now. So this idea of representativeness, this idea of battle fatigue is real. Imposter syndrome is real, thinking as if I'm going to pinch myself one day and wake up and say, you didn't get that doctorate degree. You are not the vice president, and the realities of it. So your talk has resonated with me, and I'm hopeful that it will resonate with our students as well and let them know that they are enough. They're more than enough. And that was something that you said as well that resonated with me. So thank you, Michael, for allowing me to kind of sort of share a bit of my own experience and share how much this talk has meant to me. And I hope that our students will take away some of the jewels and things that have been said, because oftentimes the seeds are planted now, but they don't grow until later. So the students will hear the talk and things may not resonate now, but trust me, as indicated, as Stephen has said, you will relish this time. You will go back to it and say, hey, I heard this. And hopefully you do take his advice and go back to that faculty member, that administrator, that person who has spoken life into you, and thank them for that. Thank them for believing in you. Thank them for hearing you, and thank them for noticing you, really seeing you. The idea and the concept of visibility is a vital one and an important one. So I'll stop there because I could go on, but I've enjoyed the talk and I appreciate you.
Thank you. And the final word, please remember on May 4th, we have another speaker who Stephen knows very well. Sean Harper is going to join us. So anyone who's here tonight, please come back. Sean is another outstanding educator and will probably be as good as you are, Stephen. I won't say better. Okay. Thank you.